Alrighty. Today we're going to talk about the influence of revolutionary ideas. In this topic, we are going to look at two main questions. How did the American Revolution affect American society? And how did the American Revolution affect global society? The American Revolution is a really big deal, of course, obviously. Uh, but not just for our sake in the United States, but globally and the impact that it had on other societies and culture. So, first thing we're going to look at is um, uh, the influence of revolutionary ideas on American society. So, revolutionary ideas impacted American society before, during, and after the war that brought the colonies freedom from British control, influencing women, enslaved workers, and American Indians. Um, so during the American Revolution, there was an increased social awareness of social inequalities um, that motivated some groups to actually abolish the ideas of slavery. So, with the abolition of slavery, it could contradict the Declaration of Independence because in that, Thomas Jefferson writes that all men are created equal. While the Continental Congress was not a fan of this idea of the complete abolition of slavery, there was a ban on the importation of enslaved people. So the international slave trade was made illegal. In the North, those states began the process of emancipation. So if you were a slave in a northern state, you would get emancipated, and slavery was made illegal in those. Southerners really were have the ones who were more reliant on the slave labor force. It all has to do with economics, 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 economics. They were a free labor source. However, slavery wasn't super depended upon as you might think until the invention of the cotton gin. The cotton gin allowed for the processing of cotton to explode. What used to take a week could now happen in a day. Um, I don't know if you've ever messed with cotton, but cotton is very coarse and thick, and they also has seeds inside of that coarse and thick material. Removing those seeds is extremely difficult, and so the process of cotton was difficult and arduous. However, the cotton gin made it super easy. It would just literally spool the seeds out of the cotton, making it a whole lot easier, and cotton was able to be produced more. So the Southerners wanted to keep the slaves for that free labor so they could increase their output of cotton and, of course, increase their economic uh, gains. The Continental. So, with this in mind, sorry, I lost what I was going to say. With this in mind, the North was emancipating slaves, the South was becoming more reliant on slaves. So the constitutional framers postponed a solution to the problem of slavery um, and the slave trade in general. But they did set the stage for recurring conflicts over these issues in the later years. So basically, slave trade internationally was made illegal, but what about the slave trade in northern states? Even though slaves are free, could I still buy and sell? Those were future problems. Let's just kick the can down the road. We'll talk about that a lot as we go into the 1800s. Meanwhile, the Declaration of Independence did no, I'm sorry. Declaration of Independence did declare our independency, and so everyone had to work with and go forward with that in mind. One of the chief demographics that were affected was women. specifically in a couple ways. One, you had the Daughters of Liberty. They organized to oppose Britain. They boycotted goods, provided war supplies. Some even fought alongside the men on the front lines, worked as cooks, nurses. Some took their husband places in battle, like Mary McCully and Molly Pitcher. Or they even disguised themselves as a man. One such was Deborah Sampson. Um, but it wasn't only female patriots, there were loyalists who also did provide support. So the Daughters of Liberty were really instrumental in pushing forward. As I said, they were extremely instrumental on the front lines with the men, just providing food or health care or even fighting. Um, but women back home also were involved in the fight. So, in response to the women's participation in the American Revolution, Enlightenment ideas, and women's appeals for expanding roles, an ideal of or Republican motherhood. I almost said American motherhood, but I meant Republican motherhood gained popularity. It called on women to teach Republican values within the family and granted women a new importance in the American political culture. Educating women so that in the home they could teach children values of a new republic and the roles of citizens, um, more active roles in shaping a new nation's political life. They were still at home, though. They weren't involved in the politics on the front lines, but they were shaping the future minds of the boys who were going to move into that ideas. And they also had to teach their daughters the civic duties so that when they grew up, they could, in fact, teach their own sons those ideals. So women were instrumental in shaping the republic of the United States because they were the one teaching it. And then, of course, we need to talk about Abigail Adams. In 1776, she wrote a letter to her husband, John Adams, good old Johnny Adams. And she was a big proponent of liberty. In the letter that I will post on Schoology, or that is posted on Schoology, she says, I long to hear that you have declared an independency, and by the way of the new code of laws, which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, as I desire, as I desire you would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. So she was promoting the inclusion of women more. Women lived politics every day. They're the ones who were at home feeding their children, who couldn't necessarily get all the supplies they needed because, well, they weren't getting them from the British like they used to be. We are now in full open rebellion, and so Britain's goods weren't coming over anymore. So they couldn't necessarily get all the needs that they had it. Um, but yeah, she wanted independence. She wanted strength for women in government. Um, but yeah, they also served an economic role, very, very important. One, they were essential to maintaining the colonial economy. For starters, they ran the family farms. While men were off in fighting on the front lines predominantly, we already did talk about women did fight on the front lines, but for a majority, men were on the front lines. So women were responsible for running the family farms. This provided food that was needed for the war effort. They also helped support clothing. Shoes are important. Clothing is important. It protects you from the environment. Without clothing, you can die to environmental factors. Those environmental factors would decimate the American armies. And when we get to the Civil War, we'll also look at how important that is because the battles of Gettysburg was specifically fought over shoes. So they were at home making the clothes that were needed. Anyway, so yeah, we are going to jump back for just a second and look at the. We're going to look at the. There it is. This image about African Americans in American society. So, in the cotton field, the the Christmas week, the sale, the parting by us two, the lash, blow for blow, in the swamp, free. Stand up a man, make way for liberty, victory, he died for me. So the last image shows Lady Liberty. Victory. African Americans did fight in the American Revolution. They fought for both the British and the American side. George Washington offered some of them emancipation, while the British also did. So it shows that a slave could go from the cotton field to being free, and that they were fighting and dying for Lady Liberty alongside the rest of the American people, making them just as American as everybody else. You also have Betsy Ross. Now, Betsy Ross, she is said to have created the first flag with the circle, the stars, and the stripes requested by George Washington. However, likely this is apocryphal, aka not true. More of folklore and legend as time went on. She probably did not create this first flag, but Betsy Ross shows the idea and the importance of women and the role in society, especially with the rise of Republican motherhood. They were the ones at home, they were the ones on the front line teaching politics, and they were just as important to the cause. So, battle was not only for men, but for women. Women were integral to the fabric of the revolution at home and on the battlefield. And this just shows women loading cannons, ready to go and help in the fight. Making clothes at home, tending to their family at home in the log cabin, got the rifle there, ready to defend. But really, oh no, but really just there to support and push the revolution forward any way they can. Another group that was affected was the American Indians. They generally were supported by the British. So after the United States won the war for independence, they did not benefit from the fighting. Further racism and greed for land caused many to view Indians as an obstacle to settlement. This obstacle to settlement would further create tensions between the American government and the American Indians. We will discuss that more, especially when we get to the Indian Wars of the late 1800s. But just know that American Indians were impacted extremely negatively. Internationally, the American Revolution and the ideals set forth by the Declaration of Independence reverberated in France, Haiti, and Latin America, inspiring future independence movements. You talked about this last year in AP World with the Latin revolutions. But the first one we're going to talk about is the French Revolution. The French Revolution is a big deal. It spanned over the course of about 10 years with the death of the king. At the end of it, the king ended up being put back on the throne. But it did actually, the French Revolution also created a lot of tension between the United States and France. We'll talk about that more when we get into John Adams' presidency. Just know that the French and the US after the war were not buddies, as you might think. As I said, we'll talk about that more. But it did inspire the French people to rise up against their French crown and fight for their independence. It ultimately did not last in this case. You also had the United Irishmen. So the Isle of Ireland was conquered by the British. The British and the Irish have had a long history of conquest and war and fighting each other. But the Irish rebelled against British rule in 1798. It was suppressed, but eventually, thanks to continued efforts, the Irish did create their own country, with only Northern Ireland being part of modern United Kingdom. You also have the Haitian Revolution, which lasted from 1791 to 1804. So this took place on the island of Haiti. It ended slavery and in numerous Latin American revolutions against European control in the 19th century. They all cited the Declaration of the Independence as the inspiration. The Haitian Revolution is just perhaps one of the most famous. When we get to the latter half of the 1800s, we'll also talk about the Cuban Revolution, also known as the Spanish American War, from our perspective. So those are a couple different international impacts. The tennis court oath. This is from World. You do not need to know this a whole heck of a lot for United States history. However, it is a consequence of the Declaration of Independence and the revolutionary ideas. So the tennis court oath was taking place in 1789. The oath was a revolutionary act, an assertion that political authority derived from the people and the representatives rather than the monarchy, just as the Declaration of Independence says. Another consequence of these ideals was the United Empire Loyalist. It was an honorific title given to the First Lord of Dorchester, the governor of Quebec during the time of the American Revolution. He was also just the Governor General of Canada. And it was also given, this title was also given to American loyalists who resettled in British North America during or after the American Revolution. So you have to think that the colonists that were loyal to the crown were driven out, which did affect the society as well. If you don't have people who are loyal to Britain, then hey, guess what? You can continue to be free. So this prevented revolution from, or a civil war from breaking out between loyalists and patriots. This is just another image of loyalist arriving. All right, so that is the basics of the American Revolutionary ideals. If you have any questions, please type them in at the end. Right now, we're going to move on to HIP analysis. You need this for your reading quiz. You need this for your reading quiz. So what is HIP? Well, HIP very simply is an acronym. It is a tool. It stands for historical context, intended audience, purpose of the document, and point of view. I know you guys covered this last year in McKinney's, but I figure you could use a review. So, historical context. When you're looking at historical context, what you should do is when reading the document, first look at the source. Most likely it'll provide the year which it is written and the general idea of what the document is talking about. From here, you can think about the historical context. So, causation. Can you make connections between the document and historical facts? That is how you can look at historical context. What caused the document to be written, in other words? Chronology. Can you place the primary source within its appropriate place in a historical narrative or timeline? When was it written? That is it. What happens before and after it? When was it written? And prior knowledge. What do you know that would help further the understanding of this primary source? I'm going to give you an example, so if you are freaking out going, don't worry, I'm going to give you an example after we go through all of them. Here are the questions you need to ask for intended audience. For whom was the source created and why? And how might this affect the reliability or accuracy of the source? So, authors, oops, I forgot to move on to the next one. I apologize. Authors are biased. This does affect the reliability and accuracy. But also, why was the source created? For whom was it created? Those are also important questions. And then purpose of the document. Now, this can kind of sometimes double with the why of the intended audience. Regardless, doesn't matter. Purpose of the documents. Why and for what reason was the source produced at the time that it was produced? And what was the author's goal? So those are the purposes of the document. Sometimes those can overlap as well. And point of view, this one can be a little bit more difficult to understand. Can you identify an important aspect of who the author is and how this might have impacted what they wrote? How this might have impacted what they wrote. Note, when you were looking at point of view, it's an important aspect of who the author is and how they might have impacted what they wrote. Important aspect and how this impacted. I cannot stress this enough. What aspect of the author impacted why they wrote what they wrote? Can you identify an influence that shaped the author or sort and explain how the influence specifically affected the document's content? I'm going to explain this more when I get to the example. And what's the main idea? What's the point the author's trying to convey? This is important for understanding the document. Yeah. So we're going to look at the hip of the Declaration of Independence. So first thing we're going to look at is the historical context. Well, causation. British Parliament and King George III began to take away freedoms from the American colonists. So I just simply identify what caused the colonists to write the Declaration of Independence. Okay? Chronology. Well, I have a clear line in facts. You have the Quartering Act, the Stamp Act, the Townshend Act, the Boston Tea Party, Intolerable Acts, First Continental Congress, and their Olive Branch Treaty. You also had Common Sense come out, Thomas Paine's Common Sense, which is what you are going to be hipping in your hipping. Yep, sure, it's a verb now. Hipping in your document or your reading quiz. I'm sorry, your reading quiz. Common Sense is what you're hipping in your reading quiz. Then you also had the Second Continental Congress, which was the thing that did write the Declaration of Independence. So I show the causation and the chronology. Taking away freedoms. This is how they were taking away freedoms in order. And then what was the prior knowledge? It was the official declaration of war by the American colonies and established them as an independent nation. That is what the Declaration of Independence is. I just knew that. So yeah, it was the official declaration of war. All right, moving on to intended audience. So the intended audience of the Declaration of Independence. For whom was this source created and why? Well, it was created for a American colonist. Well, because there was going to be war. So that's why it was a declaration of war. It was meant to show Tories or loyalists that they were not going to win in the efforts against the new Continental Congress. And it showed patriots that they were going to be now backed by a centralized authority. However, it was also created for the British Parliament and Crown, arguing that the members of those members violated the colonist rights, these rights being essential to them as Englishmen. It was showing, hey, we're not just doing this because we're doing it. That is why we're doing it. They are arguing that the members violated the colonist rights. And it was also just going out to the world in hopes to gain support for independence. One of those being France specifically, but also Spain and the Dutch later on. But the big one is the French. So the world was, you can't ask for help until you tell everybody that you're independent. How might this affect the reliability of the source, or how might this affect the reliability or the accuracy of the source? Don't know why it says of the twice. My bad. I will fix that before I upload this PowerPoint to Schoology. Well, the grievances were biased against the crown, so it doesn't have any outside perspective, um, fully biased for the colonist and against the crown. So it would be relatively unreliable if you were looking at it from the crown's perspective, but really reliable if you were a patriot. Uh, so yeah, just keep that in mind when you're looking at intended audience. All right, the purpose of the Declaration of Independence. Why or for what reason was the source produced at the time it was produced? Why? Well, it was to declare the acts against the colonists were unjust. It was a direct effect of the Crown's actions. For why or for what reason was the source produced at the time it was produced? Because the colonists couldn't stand it anymore. To declare the acts unjust, and we cannot stand for them any longer. So what's the author's goal? Well, to gain support for independence from the world powers against England and the people's colonies. That's it. That is its purpose. To gain support from world powers and for the people of the colonies. Purpose is pretty easy once you understand what the document is talking about. Point of view. You do not have to do these in order when you're doing them, by the way. You can do them in whatever order you want to. When you're sourcing documents and trying to analyze documents, do them whatever order makes the most sense to you. I'm just doing it in the order that it's provided. So, point of view. Can you identify an important aspect of who the author is and how this might have impacted what they wrote? Well, who wrote it? Well, American colonists wrote it, specifically Thomas Jefferson, but all of the Continental Congress delegates were also had a hand in it. They all signed it. So American colonists, just in general. The aspects of who the author is well, they were subjects of Britain. So how this aspect, the fact that they were subjects of Britain, impacted what they wrote? Well, English law guaranteed certain rights, and from the colonist point of view, those rights were violated. So they wanted to show that their rights were established beyond the law, and instead those were established by God. That is why the Declaration of Independence uses the words endowed by the Creator, inalienable rights endowed by the Creator. So that is my example of HIP. If you have, we're not done with point of view. I'm sorry. So that is the first question on HIP. The second question on HIP is, can you identify an influence that shaped the authors or source and explain how that influence specifically affected the document's conflict? So identify the English Bill of Rights. You could also identify just the Enlightenment in general. And the works of, maybe you can do Thomas Paine and Common Sense specifically. Whatever is fine. Just identify what influenced the author or the source. So I look at identify the English Bill of Rights. Well, how the influence specifically affected this document. I am doing this shorter than I necessarily want to because I was running out of room on the slide. But regardless, how this influences the document's content. Well, the English Bill of Rights declared the liberties of British subjects. Liberties just being the freedoms and rights of people who were under the British Crown. Well, if I explain that, explain the how their rights were being violated from the colonialist point of view when we were looking at that, explaining how the English Bill of Rights declares the liberties of British subjects, and those liberties were not being upheld by the British Crown. So it was a justification for the claim of independence. The main idea, what is the purpose of the author trying to convey? We, the American colonists, are justified in claiming our independence from Britain. That is the main idea. So if you have any questions about HIP, please ask them in the provided document. Otherwise, you can go and complete Chapter 5, Part 2, Reading Quiz. Part 3 will be due before the next class. Regardless, I hope you have a good day, and go America.